Detective Sarah Chen's latex gloves made a soft squeaking sound as she carefully lifted the porcelain doll from the evidence box. The afternoon light streaming through the windows of the Millbrook Police Department's cold case unit caught the faded blue glass eyes, and for a moment she could almost imagine the toy blinking. The doll's white cotton dress had yellowed with age, and a small tear near the left shoulder revealed the horsehair stuffing beneath. What Sarah couldn't have known, as she turned the antique over in her hands that Tuesday in March 2024, was that this seemingly innocent childhood toy had been keeping a deadly secret for 37 years. The case file lay open on her desk. Rebecca Marie Winters, age 8, disappeared October 15, 1987, Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The black and white school photograph paper-clipped to the front showed a gap-toothed smile beneath straight bangs, dark eyes that sparkled with mischief. Rebecca had vanished while walking the 4 blocks from Millbrook Elementary to her grandmother's house on Elm Street, a route she'd taken dozens of times before. Despite an extensive search involving state police, FBI, and hundreds of volunteers combing through woods, abandoned buildings, and every inch of the small Pennsylvania town, no trace of the little girl had ever been found. The case had gone cold within 2 years, relegated to a filing cabinet that Sarah had inherited when she transferred to the cold case unit 6 months earlier. The doll had been Rebecca's favorite, according to the original witness statements. Her grandmother, Eleanor Winters, had given it to her for her 7th birthday, claiming it was a family heirloom that had belonged to Rebecca's great-great-grandmother. The antique was discovered 3 days after Rebecca's disappearance, lying in a patch of maple leaves behind the old Carnegie Library on Main Street, roughly halfway between the school and her grandmother's house. The investigating officers had bagged it as evidence, but after forensic analysis revealed no useful DNA or fingerprints, it had been stored away, another dead end in a case full of them. Sarah had been drawn to the Winters case from her first day in cold cases. Perhaps it was her own daughter, Emma, who was 8 years old and bore a slight resemblance to Rebecca. Or maybe it was the thoroughness of the original investigation, led by Detective Frank Morrison, whose detailed notes revealed a man haunted by his failure to bring the child home. Morrison had died of a heart attack in 2018, taking whatever insights he might have developed over the years to his grave. Sarah felt a responsibility to continue his work, to find answers for a family that had never stopped searching. The evidence room in the basement of the police station smelled of cardboard and dust, with an underlying chemical tang from decades of preserved materials. Sarah had spent countless hours down there, re-examining every piece of physical evidence from the Winters case. The doll always seemed to draw her attention, though she couldn't articulate why. Something about its presence felt significant, as if it were trying to communicate something beyond its obvious connection to Rebecca. On this particular afternoon, Sarah was preparing for a meeting with Rebecca's mother, Linda Winters Hartley, who still lived in Millbrook and called the police department every few months asking for updates. As Sarah photographed the doll from multiple angles for her digital case file, she noticed something odd about the base. The fabric of the dress had bunched up slightly, revealing what appeared to be a small seam in the porcelain near the doll's feet. She'd handled the evidence dozens of times before, but the late afternoon sunlight was hitting it at just the right angle to reveal this subtle detail. Using a magnifying glass from her desk drawer, Sarah examined the seam more closely. It was barely visible, a hairline crack that could easily be mistaken for normal aging of the porcelain, but Sarah's instincts, honed by 15 years in law enforcement, told her this was something more. The crack was too uniform, too straight to be accidental damage. She reached for her phone and dialed the number for the State Police Forensics Lab in Harrisburg. Dr. Michael Torres, the senior forensic technician she'd worked with on several cases, answered on the second ring. "Sarah, what can I do for you today?" His voice carried the slight accent of his Puerto Rican childhood, softened by decades in Pennsylvania. "I need a favor, Mike. I've got a piece of evidence from a 1987 cold case. A porcelain doll. I think there might be something inside it, but I don't want to damage it if I'm wrong. Can you do some kind of non-invasive scan? Bring it over. We've got a new CT scanner that can image pretty much anything without touching it. When are you thinking?" Sarah glanced at her watch. It was 3:30 p.m., and the drive to Harrisburg would take an hour in traffic. "Is tomorrow morning too soon?" "I'll be here at 8. Just call when you're on your way." That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen while Emma did homework at the table nearby. The house was a modest colonial in Millbrook's Riverside neighborhood, close enough to the school that Emma could walk home, though Sarah always insisted on meeting her halfway. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was investigating the disappearance of a child the same age as her own daughter, in the same town where they both lived. "Mom, why do you keep staring at that old doll?" Emma asked, looking up from her math worksheet. Sarah had brought the evidence photo home, unable to shake the feeling that she was on the verge of a breakthrough. "It's part of a case I'm working on." Sometimes when you look at something long enough, you notice details you missed before. Emma walked over and studied the photograph with the serious expression she inherited from her father. It looks sad, like it's been waiting for someone to find it. The simple observation sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought. Perhaps that was exactly what had been happening all these years. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, typical for early March in central Pennsylvania. Sarah made the drive to Harrisburg in her unmarked Impala, the evidence box secured in the passenger seat. The State Police Forensics Lab occupied the top floor of a nondescript office building, its windows offering views of the Susquehanna River and the state capitol dome beyond. Dr. Torres met her in the lobby, his graying beard neatly trimmed, and his lab coat immaculate despite the early hour. They'd worked together on a dozen cases over the past 3 years, and Sarah had come to trust his methodical approach and attention to detail. He was the kind of scientist who would spend hours ensuring a single fiber was properly cataloged rather than rush to conclusions. The CT scanner was an impressive piece of equipment recently acquired through a federal grant. Dr. Torres explained that it could create detailed three-dimensional images of objects without any physical intrusion, showing density variations that might indicate hollow spaces or foreign objects inside solid materials. "This technology has revolutionized forensic analysis," he said as he carefully positioned the doll on the scanner's table. "We can see things that would have been impossible to detect even 10 years ago." The scanning process took 20 minutes. Sarah watched the monitors as layer upon layer of the doll's internal structure appeared on screen. The porcelain body showed the expected hollow construction typical of antique dolls, with darker areas indicating the horsehair stuffing in the torso and limbs. But as the scan progressed to the base of the doll, something unusual appeared. There, Dr. Torres pointed to a dense, rectangular shape nestled inside the lower torso. "That's definitely not horsehair or porcelain." Sarah leaned closer to the monitor. The object appeared to be roughly 2 inches long and less than an inch wide, with clean edges that suggested it was man-made rather than a natural material that might have worked its way inside the doll over time. "Can you tell what it is?" The density suggests metal, possibly steel or iron, but there's something else. Dr. Torres adjusted the scan parameters, and suddenly a second object became visible, smaller, and positioned near the doll's neck area. "This one looks like paper or thin cardboard. Rolled up, maybe." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. After 37 years, Rebecca's doll was finally ready to give up its secrets. The extraction process required the delicate touch of a surgeon. Dr. Torres used a combination of long tweezers and flexible fiber optic cameras to navigate inside the doll's body cavity. Sarah watched on a monitor as the tools moved through the internal space, approaching the mysterious objects. The paper item came out first. As Dr. Torres carefully unrolled it under bright laboratory lights, Sarah could see faded handwriting in blue ink. The paper was ordinary notebook paper, the kind used by school children, and despite being rolled tightly for decades, it had been protected from deterioration by the sealed environment inside the doll. "It's a note," Sarah whispered, reading over Dr. Torres's shoulder. The handwriting was childish but legible. "If you find this, something bad happened to me. The man with the gray truck said he knew my daddy, but daddy doesn't have a gray truck. He had candy and said there were puppies in the back. I put this in my dolly before I got in because I was scared. His name is Asterisk." The sentence ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the note from multiple angles. This was Rebecca's handwriting, according to school samples in the original case file. The child had somehow sensed danger and taken the remarkable precaution of hiding a message in her beloved doll. But who was the man with the gray truck, And what had happened to prevent Rebecca from finishing her note? The metal object proved more challenging to extract. Dr. Torres worked for nearly an hour, using a combination of magnets and specialized tools to maneuver it through the doll's internal structure. When it finally emerged, Sarah gasped. It was a small brass key, tarnished with age but still intact. Attached to it by a thin wire was a tiny metal tag with numbers stamped into it, times 142. "Storage unit key," Dr. Torres observed, turning it over in his gloved hands. "Looks like the type used by those mini-storage places." The number would correspond to a specific unit. Sarah was already on her phone, calling the station. "I need you to run a check on all storage facilities in a 50-mile radius of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. I'm looking for unit number 142, and I need to know who rented it in 1987. The response came back within an hour. There were 3 storage facilities within the search radius that had been operating in 1987. 2 of them had no record of a Unit 142, but the third hit paid dirt. Millbrook Mini Storage, located on Route 15 just outside town, showed that Unit 142 had been rented in August 1987 by one James Russell Kendrick of 47 Maple Avenue, Millbrook. The rental had been paid through November 1987, after which it had been considered abandoned and the contents disposed of according to facility policy. Sarah's heart sank. If the storage unit had been cleaned out in 1987, any evidence it might have contained was long gone. But the name James Russell Kendrick was now their first real lead in 37 years. She called Detective Lisa Park, her partner in the cold case unit, and asked her to run a full background check on Kendrick. The results were disturbing. James Russell Kendrick, born March 12, 1955, had a criminal record dating back to 1975. Multiple arrests for petty theft, drunk and disorderly conduct, and 2 charges of indecent exposure that had been pleaded down to misdemeanors. In 1988, just months after Rebecca's disappearance, Kendrick had been arrested for attempting to lure a young girl into his vehicle in a town 60 miles away. He'd served 3 years in state prison and been released in 1991. After that, the trail went cold. Sarah and Lisa drove to 47 Maple Avenue that afternoon. The house was a small Cape Cod with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. The current residents, a young couple named Martinez, had bought the property in 2003 and knew nothing about the previous owner. But their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, remembered James Kendrick very well. "Oh, that man," Mrs. Kellerman said, shaking her gray head as she stood on her front porch. She was in her 80s but sharp as a tack, with bright blue eyes that missed nothing. "Always gave me the creeps. Used to sit on his porch drinking beer and watching the children walk home from school. Had this gray pickup truck that he was always tinkering with." Sarah exchanged glances with Lisa. A gray truck, just like Rebecca had mentioned in her note. "Mrs. Kellerman, do you remember what happened to Mr. Kendrick when he moved away?" "Well, that's the strange thing. He didn't exactly move away, at least not at first. One day, in late October 1987, just before Halloween, he up and disappeared. Left everything behind. The house, the truck, all his belongings. The landlord came by a few weeks later looking for rent money, but Jimmy was just gone. Did anyone report him missing?" Mrs. Kellerman laughed bitterly. "Who was going to miss a man like that? He had no family that I knew of, no real friends. The police came by once, asked a few questions, but I got the impression they weren't too concerned about finding him." That evening, Sarah spread the case files across her dining room table while Emma worked on a school project in the living room. The pieces were starting to come together, but significant gaps remained. James Kendrick had clearly been involved in Rebecca's disappearance, but what had happened to him? And more importantly, what had happened to Rebecca? Sarah called Frank Morrison's widow, Helen, who still lived in Millbrook. Helen Morrison was a retired teacher who had known Rebecca's family well. She agreed to meet with Sarah the next morning at the local diner on Main Street. The Millbrook Diner was the kind of place that had been serving the same menu for 40 years, with red vinyl booths and a pie case that drew customers from 3 counties. Helen Morrison was waiting in a corner booth when Sarah arrived, her silver hair neatly styled and her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. "I've been expecting this call for years," Helen said after Sarah introduced herself and explained why she was there. Frank never stopped thinking about that little girl. Toward the end, when the cancer was really bad, he'd wake up in the middle of the night talking about Rebecca Winters. Said he felt like he'd failed her. Sarah pulled out a notepad. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you about James Kendrick. Did your husband ever consider him a suspect?" Helen's expression darkened. Oh, Frank knew about Jimmy Kendrick, had his eye on him from the very beginning. But there was no evidence, you understand? Jimmy had an alibi for the afternoon Rebecca disappeared. Said he was at Murphy's bar from noon until closing time, and the bartender backed him up. But your husband didn't believe the alibi? Frank always said there was something off about it. The bartender, Pete Murphy, was Jimmy's drinking buddy. They'd been covering for each other for years. But Frank could never prove it, and then Jimmy disappeared, and that was the end of it. After leaving the diner, Sarah drove to Millbrook Mini Storage. The facility was exactly what she'd expected. Rows of identical metal buildings with roll-up doors. The kind of place where people stored everything from Christmas decorations to old furniture they couldn't bear to throw away. The office was a small trailer near the entrance, staffed by a middle-aged woman named Carol, who had worked there for 15 years. "Unit 142 is in Building C," Carol said, consulting her computer records. "It's been rented continuously since 1987, actually. After the Kendrick guy stopped paying, we cleaned it out and re-rented it to someone else. Current tenant has had it for about 10 years now." Sarah's heart sank again. If the unit had been cleaned out and re-rented multiple times, any evidence would be long gone. But she asked to see it anyway, just to complete the picture. Building C was at the back of the facility, partially hidden by a grove of pine trees. Unit 142 was in the middle of the row, indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the number painted on the door. Sarah stood in front of it for several minutes, trying to imagine what James Kendrick might have stored here in 1987. On impulse, she walked to the facilities office and asked Carol if she could speak with the current tenant of Unit 142. Carol was reluctant at first, citing privacy policies, but eventually agreed to call the renter and ask if he would be willing to speak with a police detective about a cold case. The tenant turned out to be a retired plumber named George Hitchcock, who used the unit to store tools and equipment. He agreed to meet Sarah at the facility that afternoon. George was a thin man in his 70s with calloused hands and a suspicious expression that softened when Sarah explained she was investigating a child's disappearance from 1987. "I remember when they cleaned out this unit," George said as he opened the roll-up door to reveal a neatly organized space filled with PVC pipe, wrenches, and other plumbing supplies. It was quite a mess from what I heard. Previous tenant had left all kinds of junk behind. "Do you know what happened to the contents?" "Most of it went to the dump, I expect. But Carol might know more. She's been here longer than anyone." Sarah returned to the office and pressed Carol for more details about the 1987 cleanup. After some digging through old files, Carol found a work order from November 1987 describing the contents of Unit 142, miscellaneous furniture, clothing, tools, and personal effects. One large freezer unit, not working. Contents disposed of per facility policy. A freezer unit. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March weather. Why would James Kendrick have stored a broken freezer in a rented unit? Unless it wasn't really broken, and he had a specific reason for wanting to keep it cold and hidden. The next morning, Sarah decided to dig deeper into James Kendrick's background. She contacted the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections to get more information about his 1988 arrest and imprisonment. The details were sobering. Kendrick had approached a 9-year-old girl outside an elementary school in Gettysburg, offering her candy and claiming to know her parents. The girl had run away and told her teacher, who called police. When arrested, Kendrick had been driving a gray Dodge pickup truck. The corrections officer Sarah spoke with, a veteran named Thomas White, remembered Kendrick from his time at SCI Huntington. Quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, but there was something off about him. Other inmates gave him a wide berth. We had him on suicide watch twice during his sentence. Did he ever talk about other crimes? Other children? Not to me directly, but the prison chaplain might know more. Father Mackenzie worked with a lot of inmates back then. He's retired now, but he might be willing to talk to you. Father Mackenzie lived in a small apartment behind St. Mary's Catholic Church in Huntington. He was a frail man in his 80s, but his memory was crystal clear. When Sarah explained why she was there, his expression grew grave. "James Kendrick," the priest said slowly. "I remember him very well. He came to me several times during his incarceration, claimed he wanted to make a confession, but every time we sat down together he would change his mind, said he wasn't ready to face what he'd done." "Did he ever give you any details about his crimes?" Father Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the boundaries of confession confidentiality. "I can tell you this much," he said finally. "James was carrying a burden that was destroying him from the inside. He spoke often about a little girl, said he couldn't get her face out of his mind. He claimed it was an accident, that he never meant for anyone to get hurt." "Did he say what happened to her?" "Not specifically, but he did say something that has haunted me for decades. He said the truth was buried with the cold." Whatever that meant. Buried with the cold. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. What if the freezer in the storage unit hadn't been broken at all? What if Kendrick had used it to preserve Rebecca's body until he could figure out what to do with it? Sarah spent the rest of the week researching every property James Kendrick had access to in 1987. Besides his rented house on Maple Avenue, there was very little. But one detail caught her attention. Kendrick's employment records showed he had worked part-time as a groundskeeper at Millbrook Cemetery from 1985 to 1987. The cemetery was a sprawling 19th-century burial ground on the outskirts of town, with winding paths and elaborate Victorian monuments. Sarah met with the current groundskeeper, a man named Paul Reeves who had worked there for 25 years. He remembered hearing stories about James Kendrick from his predecessor. "Old Walt used to talk about that guy," Paul said as they walked among the headstones. Said Jimmy knew the cemetery better than anyone, including which graves were abandoned and forgotten. Walt always suspected Jimmy was up to something during those night shifts, but he could never prove it. Night shifts? Yeah. Jimmy volunteered for the overnight security rounds. Said he didn't mind the quiet. Walt thought it was strange, a man choosing to spend his nights alone in a graveyard. Sarah asked to see the employment records from 1987. The cemetery office was housed in a small stone building near the main entrance, its walls lined with filing cabinets containing decades of burial records. The employment file for James Kendrick was thin but revealing. He had been terminated in early November 1987 for unauthorized use of cemetery equipment and, quote, disturbing grave sites without permission. What kind of disturbance? Sarah asked the cemetery director, an elderly woman named Margaret Sims. The records aren't specific, but Walt filed a report with the police at the time. Said he found evidence that someone had been digging in the old section of the cemetery, in areas where there hadn't been fresh burials for decades. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Do you still have Walt's report? Margaret searched through several filing cabinets before producing a yellowed carbon copy of a police report dated November 8, 1987. The investigating officer was listed as Detective Frank Morrison. According to the report, cemetery groundskeeper Walter Kowalski had discovered signs of recent digging near several old graves in the cemetery's northeast section. The disturbances appeared to be unauthorized, but nothing had been stolen and no graves had been actually opened. Morrison had interviewed James Kendrick about the incidents, but Kendrick denied any involvement. Without additional evidence, no charges were filed. The report was marked Case Closed, Insufficient Evidence, but Sarah noticed something Morrison might have missed in 1987, the dates of the reported disturbances. According to Walt Kowalski's notes, the unauthorized digging had occurred on 3 separate nights, October 16th, October 20th, and October 28th. Rebecca Winters had disappeared on October 15th. Sarah spent the rest of the day walking through the northeast section of Millbrook Cemetery, studying the old headstones and looking for signs of disturbance. Most of the graves dated from the 1880s and 1890s, with elaborate Victorian monuments that had weathered decades of Pennsylvania winters. The area was overgrown with ivy and wild roses, making it difficult to spot anything unusual. But as the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, Sarah noticed something odd about one particular gravesite. The headstone belonged to one beloved daughter, Emily Rose Patterson, who had died in 1889 at the age of 8. The marble angel that topped the monument had shifted slightly, as if the ground beneath it had settled unevenly. More importantly, The grass around the grave was a slightly different shade of green than the surrounding area, suggesting the soil had been disturbed and replanted within the past few decades. Sarah called the state police and requested a ground-penetrating radar unit. The technology could detect subsurface anomalies without disturbing the grave site, and if Rebecca's remains were buried there, the radar would reveal the presence of organic material that didn't belong. The radar scan took place on a gray Thursday morning in late March. Dr. Torres operated the equipment while Sarah and Lisa watched the monitors, looking for anything unusual beneath Emily Patterson's grave. The original coffin appeared exactly where it should be, about 6 feet down, and clearly outlined on the radar display. But there was something else. There, Dr. Torres pointed to a smaller anomaly about 4 feet down, positioned between the original coffin and the surface. That's definitely organic material, and it's not where it should be according to the original burial records. Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 37 years, they might finally have found Rebecca Winters. The legal proceedings took 2 weeks. Judge Patricia Walsh reviewed the evidence and granted permission for the exhumation, stipulating that the original grave must be restored to its previous condition once the investigation was complete. Sarah personally called Linda Winters Hartlead to explain what they had found and what would happen next. Linda's reaction was a mixture of relief and anguish. "All these years, I've wondered if she might still be alive somewhere, maybe with amnesia or being held by someone who took care of her," Linda said through tears. "At least now we'll know." The exhumation began on a cold April morning. The cemetery had been cordoned off with police tape, and a team of forensic anthropologists worked with painstaking care to excavate the area above Emily Patterson's original coffin. Sarah watched from behind the yellow tape, her hands clenched into fists as the team worked with brushes and small tools to expose whatever lay buried in the dark earth. It took 6 hours to reach the anomaly detected by the ground-penetrating radar. When the first bones appeared, small and unmistakably human, Sarah had to step away from the excavation site. After so many months of investigation, the reality of finding a child's remains was overwhelming. Dr. Patricia Coleman, the forensic anthropologist leading the excavation, worked with methodical precision. As more bones were exposed, it became clear that the remains were those of a young child, approximately 7 to 9 years old, based on the size and development of the skeletal elements. "There's evidence of trauma," Dr. Coleman announced quietly, pointing to a depression in the skull that was visible even to Sarah's untrained eye. Blunt force trauma to the posterior region of the cranium. This would have been fatal. Among the bones, the excavation team found scraps of fabric that matched the description of the clothes Rebecca had been wearing when she disappeared: a pink sweater and blue jeans. There was also a small locket that Linda Winters Hartley later identified as a gift she had given Rebecca for her 8th birthday. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for formal identification. DNA testing confirmed what Sarah already knew in her heart. They had found Rebecca Marie Winters. After 37 years, the little girl was finally coming home. But finding Rebecca's body only answered part of the mystery. James Kendrick was still out there somewhere, and Sarah was determined to find him. The Pennsylvania State Police issued a nationwide BOLO alert, and Sarah contacted law enforcement agencies across the country, sharing Kendrick's description and criminal history. The break came from an unexpected source. Detective Ray Morrison, Frank Morrison's son who worked for the Philadelphia Police Department, called Sarah after seeing the news coverage of Rebecca's discovery. Ray had grown up hearing his father talk about the Winters case, and he had some information that might be relevant. "My dad kept a private file on the case," Ray explained. "Stuff he couldn't put in the official record because it was based on hunches and theories rather than evidence. After he died, I found it in his desk at home. There's something in there about James Kendrick that you need to see." Ray drove to Millbrook that weekend and met Sarah at the police station. The private file was a manila folder containing handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and photographs that Frank Morrison had collected over the years. One item immediately caught Sarah's attention: a letter postmarked from Tucson, Arizona, and dated December 3, 1991. The letter was brief and unsigned. "Detective Morrison, I know you never stopped looking for the truth about the little girl. I'm sorry for what happened. It was never supposed to go that far. She fought harder than I expected, and when she fell and hit her head, there was so much blood. I panicked and made everything worse. I moved her to the cold place first. then to where she could rest with the other angels. The gray truck is at the bottom of Miller's Pond. J.K. Chot. Sarah stared at the letter, her mind racing. Your father never followed up on this? Ray shook his head. He tried. Went to Tucson twice. Spent his own money trying to track down Kendrick. But it's a big city, and the guy was obviously using fake names and staying off the grid. Dad eventually gave up, but he kept the letter. I think he hoped someday the technology would exist to trace it back to Kendrick. Sarah immediately contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and requested assistance in tracking James Kendrick. The profile they developed painted a picture of a man driven by compulsion and guilt, someone who might have developed an elaborate system of self-justification over the decades, but who was ultimately haunted by his actions. Agent Caroline Foster, the FBI profiler assigned to the case, believed Kendrick was still alive and possibly still living in the southwestern United States. Men like this often gravitate toward areas where they can disappear into the population, she explained. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, places with transient communities and less rigorous record-keeping. The search for James Kendrick became a multi-agency effort coordinated by the FBI. His photograph, age progressed to show what he might look like at 69 years old, was distributed to law enforcement agencies, homeless shelters, and social service organizations across the Southwest. The response came from an unexpected source, a social worker in Las Cruces, New Mexico, named Maria Santos. She recognized the age-progressed photograph as a man who had been receiving services at a local homeless shelter under the name John Kendall. The man had been living in Las Cruces for at least 5 years, working odd jobs and staying mostly to himself. Sarah flew to New Mexico with Agent Foster and 2 U.S. Marshals. The homeless shelter was a converted warehouse in a rundown part of the city, serving meals and providing temporary housing for transients and people struggling with addiction or mental illness. They found James Russell Kendrick in a small room at the back of the shelter, sitting on a narrow cot and staring out a window at the desert landscape. He had aged dramatically from his 1987 mugshot. His hair was completely gray, his face was deeply lined, and his hands trembled with what might have been Parkinson's disease, or simply the effects of decades of guilt and alcohol abuse. When Sarah identified herself as a police detective investigating the disappearance of Rebecca Winters, Kendrick's reaction was immediate and devastating. He began sobbing uncontrollably, his entire body shaking as 37 years of suppressed anguish poured out of him. I've been waiting for you, he whispered through his tears. I knew someday you'd find me. I'm glad it's over. The confession took place over 3 days in the Las Cruces Police Department. Kendrick waived his right to an attorney, saying he wanted to tell the truth about what had happened to Rebecca. His account was detailed and consistent, corroborating much of what the investigation had already revealed. According to Kendrick, he had been drinking heavily on the afternoon of October 15, 1987, when he spotted Rebecca walking home from school. He claimed he had no intention of harming her, that he had simply wanted to talk to a child because he was lonely and depressed. He offered her candy and told her he knew her father, hoping to gain her trust. Rebecca was suspicious, but eventually got into his truck when he claimed there were puppies in the back that needed help. Once they were driving, she became frightened and demanded to be let out. When Kendrick refused, she tried to jump from the moving vehicle. He grabbed her arm to stop her, causing the truck to swerve off the road and strike a tree. She hit her head on the dashboard, Kendrick said, his voice barely audible. There was so much blood. I tried to wake her up, but she was gone. I never meant for that to happen. I just wanted someone to talk to. Panicked and drunk, Kendrick had driven Rebecca's body to his storage unit, where he had hidden it in an old freezer while he tried to figure out what to do. For 3 weeks, he had wrestled with guilt and terror, drinking heavily and barely functioning. Finally, using his access to the cemetery, he had buried her in the forgotten section where he knew no one would disturb her. I thought she'd be safe there, he said. With the other children who died too young, I never touched her inappropriately. I just wanted her to have some peace. After disposing of Rebecca's body, Kendrick had driven his truck to Miller's Pond and pushed it into the deep water. He had then hitchhiked out of Pennsylvania, eventually making his way west, where he had lived under assumed names for 37 years. The pond where Kendrick claimed to have disposed of his truck was dragged the following month. Divers found the rusted remains of a gray Dodge pickup exactly where he said it would be, along with Rebecca's school backpack, which had apparently been left in the vehicle. James Russell Kendrick was extradited to Pennsylvania and charged with kidnapping, involuntary manslaughter, and abuse of a corpse. At his sentencing hearing, he addressed Rebecca's family directly for the first time. "I know there's nothing I can say that will bring your daughter back or take away your pain," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "But I want you to know that not a day has gone by in 37 years that I haven't thought about Rebecca and wished I could undo what happened. She was innocent and beautiful, and she didn't deserve what happened to her." Linda Winters Hartley was present at the sentencing, along with her husband Robert and their 2 younger children. When given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, Linda's words were measured and dignified. "You took away our little girl's future," she said, looking directly at Kendrick. "You took away her graduations, her wedding day, the children she might have had. You took away 37 years of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and bedtime stories. But you didn't take away our love for her, and you didn't take away her memory. Rebecca will always be 8 years old in our hearts. Always be our beautiful little girl who loved her dolly and wanted to be a teacher when she grew up." Kendrick received a sentence of 25 years to life, with a possibility of parole after 20 years due to his age and cooperation with the investigation. Given his advanced age and declining health, it was unlikely he would ever be released. Rebecca Marie Winters was laid to rest in Millbrook Cemetery on a sunny May morning, 37 years after her disappearance. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including classmates who were now adults with children of their own, teachers who had never forgotten their missing student, and law enforcement officers who had worked on the case over the decades. Sarah stood at the back of the gathering, holding her daughter Emma's hand as they listened to the eulogies and prayers. The antique doll that had held the key to solving the case was buried with Rebecca, finally returned to the little girl who had loved it so much. After the service, Linda Winters Hartley approached Sarah and handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photograph of Rebecca along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for bringing our little girl home. Love, the Winters Hartley family." That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen reviewing the final case report. The investigation had taken 8 months, from the moment she first noticed the unusual seam in the doll's base to the day James Kendrick was sentenced. It had involved dozens of law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, and civilian witnesses who had kept Rebecca's memory alive for nearly 4 decades. Emma looked up from her homework and asked, "Mom, do you think the little girl is happy now?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She thought about Rebecca's final note, hidden in her beloved doll as a beacon of hope that someday someone would find the truth. She thought about a family's long journey through grief toward some measure of peace. She thought about justice, imperfect and delayed, but ultimately served. "I think she is," Sarah said finally. "I think she's been waiting a long time for someone to bring her home, and now she can rest." The Rebecca Winters case would go down as one of the most significant cold case solves in Pennsylvania history, demonstrating how new technology and fresh perspectives could breathe life into investigations that had been dormant for decades. But for Sarah, it would always be more than a professional triumph. It was a reminder that every victim deserves a voice, every family deserves answers, and sometimes the smallest clues, hidden in the most unexpected places, can unlock the biggest mysteries. The antique doll had indeed been keeping a secret for 37 years, just as Emma had intuited that first evening when she observed that it looked like it was waiting for someone to find it. In the end, Rebecca's beloved toy had served as her final gift to her family, a message of love transcending death, and a path to the truth that would finally set them all free.